Core of the Bible podcast number 81, No Longer Common or Unclean. Welcome to the Core of the Bible weekly podcast, where we go a little deeper into topics taken from the daily articles. My name is Steve, and I'll be your host as we explore the message of the Bible reduced to its simplest form. Now, as you may know, it's my belief that the Core of the Bible message consists in principles derived from the Ten Commandments and the Sermon on the Mount. And these include the topics of kingdom, integrity, vigilance, holiness, trust, forgiveness, and compassion. Today, we're going to be looking at the topic of vigilance and how, when we receive instruction from God, we must be faithful in keeping it at all costs and without hesitation. Along the way, we're going to investigate the meaning of what was considered a common thing and what was considered unclean. These designations were critical to the Hebraic understanding of how they were expected to interact with others in the world. And we're going to be exploring this passage in Acts chapter 10. In Acts 10, it says, Peter became hungry and wanted to eat, but while they were preparing something, he fell into a trance. He saw heaven opened and an object that resembled a large sheet coming down, being lowered by its four corners to the earth. In it were all the four-footed animals and reptiles of the earth and the birds of the sky. And a voice said to him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." "No, Lord," Peter said, "for I have never eaten anything common or unclean." This story of Peter's vision is typically used as a way of teaching that God was declaring all foods clean or acceptable to eat. However, looking more closely at the context and outcome, we can learn more about its true meaning, along with some aspects of vigilance in our walk with God. During Peter's vision, when he heard a voice commanding him to kill and eat any of the animals, Peter immediately responded with, "No, Lord, for I have never eaten anything common or unclean." And the response from the voice was, "What God has cleansed, do not call common." And after 3 repeated occurrences, the sheet and the animals were taken back up into heaven. Now, what's interesting to note here is that in the original text, 2 different Greek words were used to describe the status of the animals. Peter says that he had never eaten anything common, or koinou, nor had he eaten anything ritually unclean, which is the Greek word akatharton. Now, there's wisdom in understanding the difference between that which is common and that which is unclean. So let's take a look at how these topics were covered throughout the Tanakh, or Old Testament. In Leviticus 10, it says, "You must distinguish between the holy and the common, and the clean and the unclean, and teach the Israelites all the statutes that Yahweh has given to them through Moses." So here we find the importance that the priests had in distinguishing between 4 Hebrew words describing 4 different conditions: Kadesh, or holy; Chol, or common; Tameh, unclean; and Tahor, clean or pure. So is this designation of holy common or clean unclean just a repetition of the same 2 qualities, or is it describing 4 different categories? Well, let's look at some other example verses to see if we can gain some clarity. Now, before there were ever any official commandments at Sinai, we see that there was already a recognition of clean, tahor, and unclean, tameh, animals. In Genesis 7, it says, "Then Yahweh said to Noah, 'Go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, and the male and his mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, the male and his mate.'" So the first mention of tahor, or clean, is in regard to animals, distinguishing those that are clean from those that are not clean or tahor. We next move to the wilderness after Israel came out of Egypt, and we learn the distinctions that were set down within the written Torah conveyed to them in the desert. Leviticus 11 says, "This is the law about beast and bird and every living creature that moves through the waters and every creature that swarms on the ground, to make a distinction between the unclean and the clean, and between the living creature that may be eaten and the living creature that may not be eaten." So here, clean, tahor, and unclean, tame, animals are here defined in God's Torah. Now, as we look to define that which is holy versus that which is common, we can look at some passages from the writings of the prophets, starting with Ezekiel. In Ezekiel's vision of the temple and its surroundings, he conveys how some areas of the temple complex were distinguished from others. In Ezekiel 42, it says, "He measured the temple complex on all four sides, and it had a wall around it to separate the holy, the Kadesh, from the common, the Chol." Here there's no mention of clean and unclean, just how a wall separated the holy and common areas. The one area of the temple complex was holy, restricted only to priests and God's people, and the other area was common, available to anyone else. A similar example of this is brought out in the land allotments that Ezekiel conveyed from his vision. In Ezekiel 48 it says, "And alongside the territory of the priests the Levites shall have an allotment, and they shall not sell or exchange any of it. They shall not alienate this choice portion of the land, for it is holy to Yahweh. The remainder shall be for common use for the city, for dwellings and for open country, and in the midst of it shall be the city." So here, part of the land is holy or kodesh for specific use by the priests, and the other part for use by the rest of the city is common or chol. So from these passages, we can learn that the distinction between the holy and common appears to be one of purpose. That which is holy is set apart for a specific use by priests or God's people only, and that which is common is for everyday use by anyone. By contrast, that which is clean or unclean appears to be inherent in the thing itself. For example, those animals which were approved for eating versus those which were not approved for eating, likely due to the risk of contracting illness or disease. Now, here's a really interesting contrast brought out in the book of Haggai when he was asking the priests to give a ruling in a matter of holiness versus uncleanness, a contrast that was spanning both groups. So in Haggai 2, it says, "If a man is carrying consecrated, that is holy or kodesh, meat in the fold of his garment, and it touches bread, stew, wine, oil, or any other food, does that food become holy?" And the priests answered no. Then Haggai asked, "If someone unclean or tame, by contact with a corpse, touches any of these, does it become defiled?" And the priests answered, "It becomes defiled." Then Haggai replied, "So is this people, and so is this nation before me. This is Yahweh's declaration, and so is every work of their hands, even what they offer here is defiled." So Haggai is here using this example to show the priests how they were not accomplishing their God-given purpose of being a light of holiness to the world. Instead, they had become so corrupt that they had become unclean and were defiling everything they touched. So here we have a cross comparison of these two categories, holy common and clean unclean. And when we sift through all of this information, we can begin to see how this description actually helps us understand the categories a little better. From Haggai's example, it's determined that something that is holy can't make something holy just by contacting it. Like Ezekiel, he's confirming the holiness is in the purpose of the thing, not its physical qualities. By contrast, something that is unclean can defile something else. Once the unclean thing touches something, it also becomes unclean. So how does all of this apply to Peter's vision and our discussion at hand? Well, we need to remember through this discussion that common means for common use or that which is not set apart as holy. And in Peter's vision, God claims to have cleansed that which is considered common, that is, the non-Jews who seek after him. In a moment, we'll explore this cleansing process as it was understood by the traditional Jews of the day and why it is so significant to this discussion. Now, in Yeshua's and Peter's day, something that may have been considered common was a term that had come into use within the lexicon of the Pharisees and their fastidious overcompensation in matters that were not clearly marked out in Torah. For example, in Mark 7, some of these practices are described. It says in the beginning of the chapter that the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Yeshua, and they observed that some of his disciples were eating bread with common, that is, unwashed, hands. Well, right here we have this distinction clarified for us within the narrative. Common equals unwashed. The narrative continues, "For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, keeping the tradition of the elders." Note, this is not a Torah instruction, but a tradition of the elders. So, with the koinou meaning of common defined as unwashed for us here in Mark, we can then see how this applies in the vision that Peter had in Acts 10. Again, in Acts 10, it says, "A second time the voice came to him, 'What God has cleansed, do not call common.'" And this shows that God had cleansed that which, through their tradition, was considered common or unwashed. In that time, non-Jews were looked upon as common, like dirty hands that needed to be washed. And the traditional Jewish thinking was that they were to be avoided because through contact with their unwashed condition, they thought they would become contaminated as well. However, we know from the passage in Haggai that holiness has to do with purpose and has nothing whatsoever to do with physical contact. Besides, Peter's vision said that God had cleansed those dirty hands when they came to him in faith, and they were therefore no longer to be considered separate from the believing congregation. And this is the exact meaning that Peter pulled from the vision when he met with Cornelius and his group. Further on in Acts 10, it says, Peter said to them, "You know it's forbidden for a Jewish man to associate with or visit a foreigner." And again, this is based on tradition, not Torah. "But God has shown me that I must not call any person common or unclean." You see, Peter had taken away from the vision not that all foods were now clean, but that all men who earnestly were striving after God were to be considered on an even par with the Jewish believers. Acts 10, he says, Peter began to speak, "Now I truly understand that God doesn't show favoritism, but in every nation the person who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him." Peter had taken the real meaning of the vision to mean that God was breaking down the barriers between men of different nations, and that the door of faith in Messiah would be open to all who were willing to come. And this was even confirmed to be the correct interpretation, as the foreign men were visibly affected by receiving the Spirit of God, later on in the chapter in verses 44 and 45. So, to me, it's very impressive to see how Peter had maintained his ritual purity throughout his life. He claims to have strictly followed the dietary laws of Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14 without fail. And in his day and age, there were many opportunities to eat the wrong foods due to the foods that were sold in the common marketplaces. Peter demonstrates that he was always vigilant to ensure he never violated the commands of God by eating foods outside the restrictions of Torah. This in itself should be an indication that the vision was not about clean and unclean foods, but about something else, something God was beginning to do among all nations. Additionally, Peter intimated that he had not only kept the dietary commands of the Torah, but of the religious tradition as well. And this would imply he also did not associate with non-Jews, since they were considered koinou, or common, by Jewish tradition. We know that this is the case because the Apostle Paul had to confront Peter when he had held to this traditional Jewish thinking among the believers in Antioch. In Galatians 2, Paul writes, "But when Cephas, or Peter, came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned, for he regularly ate with the Gentiles before certain men came from James. However, when they came, he withdrew and separated himself because he feared those from the circumcision party. Then the rest of the Jews joined his hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy." Now, while there are no time markers in the text, it would make sense that this argument between Paul and Peter occurred prior to Peter's vision, and that after that vision, he was well grounded in the understanding of the purpose of the kingdom, and how God would not show favoritism to anyone, but was accepting all who would come to him through faith in Messiah. But regardless of the timing of this event, as the growing messianic movement spread, It was inevitable that non-Jews would be mixing with Jewish believers, and there would need to be a recognition of equality among all people. The Apostle Paul confirms this also in several of his epistles, how God was growing the kingdom with many different nationalities and statuses within the strata of society. In Romans 10, it says, "For the Scripture says, everyone who believes on him will not be put to shame, since there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, because the same Lord of all richly blesses all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of Yahweh will be saved." Galatians 3, it says, "There is no Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female, since you are all one in Messiah Yeshua." In Colossians 3, it says, "In Messiah there is not Greek and Jew, circumcision and uncircumcision, barbarian, Scythian, slave and free, but Messiah is all and in all." So ultimately, vigilance in our walk before God comes in many forms, whether our own personal commitment to holiness or our obedience to the things that God may reveal to us along the way. Peter exemplifies for us a measure of personal vigilance that we can learn from and follow in our own lives. He held tightly to the understanding of Judaism and maintained those traditions faithfully, believing that he was honoring God in doing so. Yet, when God revealed something radical within his current worldview, he was still willing to follow this new understanding wholeheartedly and unreservedly. So when we receive instruction from God, whether through his word or through personal insight, we also must be faithful in keeping it at all costs and without hesitation. Well, once again, I hope I've been able to provide you some ideas and concepts to meditate on further. If you enjoyed this week's podcast, be sure to visit coreofthebible.org to read daily articles on these topics and to find out more about the message of the Bible reduced to its simplest form in the 10 Commandments and the Sermon on the Mount. Do you have questions about today's topic or comments or insights you'd like to share? Feel free to email me at coreofthebible@gmail.com. Thanks for your interest in listening today. As always, I hope to be invited back into your headphones in another episode to come. Take care.